Well, good morning, my friends. My name is George Kazlusky, Kaz to just about everyone, and I'm your worship leader this morning. Here are this morning's announcements. First of all, one that's not included here, but Reverend Jen will not have office hours for the next 2 weeks as she will be on vacation. She can still be reached by phone or text for emergency pastoral needs. Help us find our next music director. We are seeking a musical director and accompanist for the Tree of Life, UUC. As you know, Cassandra and Billy have both resigned. We're going to miss them. These two roles could be separated as well. You know anybody that might be interested? Take a look at our job description on indeed.org and contact us with questions or an application. The link to the job posting will be shared in the chat. We are offering Worship and Liturgical Year as our subject today at Inquirers. Inquirers is our Get to Know You program for newcomers. We meet today at 12:15 using the same link as this service. Don't worry, we'll give you a break between coffee hour and the session to get away from your screen. We will end no later than 1:15. This is an easy, no obligation way to learn more about Unitarian Universalism in this congregation. The church office will be open on Tuesdays, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. for on-site business. You are welcome to stop by during those hours, but please wear a mask when in the building, even if you are fully vaccinated. Women's Book Club will meet by Zoom to discuss Gilead by Marilyn Robinson on August 6th at 7 p.m. Zoom information is in the Happening and Breeze events. Men's group is back and will meet Thursday, July 22nd at Randy Meyer's house starting at 5 p.m. Contact Randy if you're interested in attending. Thank you for the generous support that members and friends of the congregation and members of the public in response to our recent urgent fundraising appeal for the homeless. We have over $2,000 on hand, enough to supply both our Woodstock distribution point at Warp Core and our new regular participation in the Community Empowerment Shower Collaborative Service event at Willow Creek Crystal Lake. We will continue to need a steady stream of contributions to keep up with the increased demand, and we are also trying to build reserves so that we may continue to contribute to supplying hotel rooms in case of another cold weather snap emergency this winter. Money donations can be made to Luke by check with Compassion for Campers on the memo line or donate online using the Breeze link. Tree of Life has started its first Solidarity Circle. A Solidarity Circle is a group of trained supporters who help a person recently released from prison. The goal is to help navigate the many roadblocks that incarcerated person might experience. In this model, the formerly incarcerated is actually known as the circle leader. The man who we are currently helping, Jim, has some needs you may be able to assist with. See the article about this in the Happenings and contact Cheryl Nemo if you have a lead on any of these items. We need a volunteer or two to help take notes for joys and concerns at our online services. If you're willing to write down what is shared and then email those notes to Karen Meyer in the office, please let Karen or Judy know. And finally, we want to get to know you and answer your questions. If you're new to Tree of Life, we hope you will fill out the visitor online card that will be posted in the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself during Joys and Concerns. We invite you to join us for coffee hour breakouts after the service, and especially invite you to our Inquirers session. We are a friendly bunch and welcome a chance to get to know you. We welcome all who have joined us this morning, and so we begin our service. Once again, good morning. Welcome to Tree of Life Unitarian Universalist Congregation online service. We welcome back to our pulpit this morning the Reverend Mary Dicken. Reverend Mary is an ordained United Methodist clergy person, currently serving at Meridian Street United Methodist Church in Indianapolis, and previously serving churches throughout southern Indiana and in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Her sermon topic today will be Sacred Disruptions. And now with our call to worship, Reverend Mary.
Good morning. It is great to be with all of you today. Friends, let us gather in this moment, just as we are. Questioner, seeker, sure or unsure believer, for we matter more than doctrine, liturgy, or creed. And let us gather in this space just as we are, less than perfect and fully human in all of our needs and our longings. And let us gather in this space wherever we find ourselves today, just as we are. Each of us created in the poetry of love and formed from the imagination of the divine. Let us interrupt the world as is this morning, wherever we are, and worship together.
Thanks, Mary. Lighting our chalice this morning will be Rebecca Heisler. Rebecca.
Okay, Kaz, thank you very much. Okay, now you can see me, I think. Today's topic is religion, is music for the chalice. Music is my religion, and I was attracted to Tree of Life almost 30 years ago because of the excellent music produced by members of this church, and I saw in several kinds of productions. And so today's chalice lighting is a thank you to this church for giving me a musical home, and to the people who made it possible. That would be including Kathy Brunke, Tom Steffens, Forrest Ransberg, Cassandra and Billy, and my fellow choir members and / family. You mean more to me than you'll ever know. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Now, please join us in recalling our purpose. We journey as a family toward spiritual growth, freedom in faith, celebration of diversity, commitment to action, devotion to each other, the community, and the earth. And now with some truly special music. We proudly welcome back our Tree of Life Choir, singing live on our own church grounds for the first time since March of 2020. The choir will sing Peter Mayer's Justice Choir.
Song. And if you want a way to raise your voice up high, you can be a singer in the Justice Choir. If you are a citizen heavy of heart, you can take a tenor or an alto part. You can be a flame in a great big fire. You can be a singer in the shameless lie. Sing about freedom in the justice choir. Sing about the weak in the halls of power. Sing about the earth in a desperate hour. Sing about the poor when the rich conspire. Sing about love in the justice choir. Sing out, make a better world. Make the sound wave like a flag unfurled. Sing out like a liberty bell. Ring out the truth you tell. Sing out, make it be known. Sing like the trumpets of Jericho. Sing out at the tyrant's wall. Sing until the last brick falls. If you want to shout, want to right some wrong, you can sing about it in a righteous song. And if you want a way to raise your voice up high, you can be a singer in the justice choir.
I don't even know all the people in your choir, but I thought that was delightful. So thank you for sharing that today. It was really a treat, and I could tell there was much joy there in singing together outside the church today. So what a wonderful way to celebrate. It's good to be back with all of you today. If you were with us last time I was here, I mentioned that I bring my full self with me into this space. And so that means that I carry with me all of the traditions and the patterns of my faith tradition and ministry. And when I preach, which I did it at my own church this morning. So when I preach, just like I did this morning, I typically take a moment to pray before doing so. And so in that spirit, I invite you to pause for a moment with me as I begin today in that same way. Living God, may your word be proclaimed, and may we claim it with joy for our lives today. Continue to speak to all of us through my words, or perhaps even in spite of them. Amen. So as we begin today, I have a confession to make, and I don't perhaps know all of you well enough to be offering you my confessions, but I'm going to do it anyway. And my confession to offer to you today is that I have been more than a little cranky this week. And I find myself rather easily irritated by things that aren't happening how I think that they should happen. My tolerance for the things and the people that annoy me right now is rather limited. So I'm having to work extra hard to be pleasant most mornings. I have my big mug of coffee with me, but even self-medicating with coffee isn't quite doing the trick these days. But for what it's worth, I recognize that this crankiness that I recognize it as it's happening. And I think I even know why it's happening. I think it's happening because I'm tired. I haven't slept well this week. I have been late to bed most nights, unable to turn things off in my brain enough to crash for the night. And then on multiple occasions, I have found myself wide awake at 4 a.m., which is a rather depressing occurrence for those of us who are decidedly not morning people. Lack of sleep will make me tired. And when I am tired, I'm cranky. Though I'm not sure that it's entirely fair to blame my tiredness solely on my abnormal sleep patterns this week. Because if I'm honest, I think perhaps some of it is self-induced. You see, I'm one of these people who lives by my calendar. If something is not on my calendar, it's not happening. You all were on my calendar this morning, so I'm here. If you hadn't been on there, I wouldn't have shown up. But not only does my calendar tell me how my days are supposed to unfold, but they also reveal a record of how I spent my time. And I looked at that calendar the other day, and I realized that I have had 2 straight weeks of nonstop work. Every day for 2 weeks, I've had something on my calendar that was work. And oftentimes those work commitments, they covered like a 12+ hour span on my carefully calendared day. And, today, this day is going to be one of those days. But, even those days that aren't overpacked with work, that perhaps just have 1 or 2 appointments thrown on them, well, it turns out there's still a problem for me. Because one of the things I have learned about myself in my time in ministry so far is that I need rest days. And those rest days, well, they actually have to be days of rest. It's tempting to see like the open span of time on those days and slip in just one meeting or appointment with someone and kind of justify it by saying, it's no big deal. It's just one little thing. I'll still have the rest of the day. But I've learned that that doesn't work. Days of rest aren't days of rest when they're interrupted by that one little thing that pulls me back into work mode. So for 2 weeks, I haven't had a real day of rest. And that is a problem. It makes me tired. And when I'm tired, I get cranky. So I mentioned to you all that I bring my faith traditions with me today. And so in that spirit, there is a story in the Bible that I've been reading this week. And I think it's worth looking at here this morning because it reveals something about overscheduling and the toll that it takes. So if you bear with me a minute, I want you to just hear these words. They're from the 6th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, and it's verses 30 through 34. So it's just a small little passage. And it says this: "The apostles returned to Jesus and told him everything they had done and taught. Many people were coming and going, so there was no time to eat. He said to the apostles, 'Come by yourself to a secluded place and rest for a while.' They departed in a boat by themselves for a deserted place. And many people saw them leaving and recognized them, so they ran ahead from all the cities and arrived before them. When Jesus arrived and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And then he began to teach them many things." So Mark's gospel has a rather unique perspective in the Bible. This gospel writer tends to get right down to business. So at this point in the story, we're only 6 chapters in to the story that the gospel writer is telling. And Jesus, in those 6 chapters, has already had this span of nonstop activity. If you read the whole gospel, we're told he got a little bit of shut-eye in the 4th chapter. It did come up there, but it was probably not the best quality of sleep, because that's the story where he was sleeping on a boat and then he was woken from his slumber by all these disciples who were with him because they were panicking that they were all going to drown. Probably not the most restful sleep. And then since then, he, according to Mark's gospel, he freed a demoniac. And that's this crazy story where 2,000 pigs go over a cliff. He healed a woman who'd been bleeding for a dozen or so years. He raised the daughter of a man named Jairus back to life. He did some teaching, and then he sent his disciples out on their own for the first time. And he was really busy. And it all happened rather quickly. And then to pile on this inevitable exhaustion of this frenetic pace of life that's happening, Jesus finds out that the king has murdered his cousin, John the Baptist. So now he is tired and he's weighed down with grief. And the busyness hasn't let up. So in that passage I read, I don't know if you caught it, it has one of the most relatable verses I have read lately, where it says, "There was no time to eat." And I think, how often has that been the case? There was no time to eat. So life has taken a toll on Jesus and on his entourage, and he knows it. So being the good boss that he is, he turns to all of them and he says in this moment, "Come on, let's get away from here and rest a while." It's time. They all need a break. They need a day on their calendar with nothing scheduled. So they get in a boat and they start to soak up a little bit of R&R. But unfortunately, as the gospel writer tells it, we don't get to rest there with them for very long. This respite is short-lived because word got out about where they were heading for this overdue vacation, and a bunch of folks crashed it. It said, if you recall, it said they ran ahead and arrived before them. So by the time Jesus and his disciples are on this boat and they reach the shore, and then there's a large crowd already waiting for them. Vacation is over, it seems. So this is the point in the story that I've been reading this week where I realize how much I am not like Jesus. Because I watched this scene play out in my head, and my immediate reaction is that crankiness that I know really well. Because if I had tried to finally get some downtime and I found it so rudely interrupted, I would be incredibly irritated. But Jesus has a different reaction in this story. It says he had compassion. Like I said, he and I are not the same. But Jesus has compassion on them, and he lets go of his retreat plans to be fully present to the needs of these people who accosted him. He starts taking care of them, teaching them. And then it's this famous scene right after this where he's feeding them with a miracle of just a few loaves and fishes that get multiplied into an abundant meal. And I can't help but wonder, how does he make this pivot so quickly from vacation mode to work in an instant? But perhaps the answer lies in the text itself, in that word, compassion. So this is an instance where modern English translations don't always do the text justice. You know, one of the problems we have when we read ancient writings is unless we are like really skilled in Greek or Hebrew or whatever it is written in, we are reading somebody's translation of these words. And the Greek word that is used here for compassion, well, it's a wonderfully descriptive word. I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. And the word is splanchnizomai. Splanchnizomai. And it literally means a churning on the insides, to feel it in the gut. So Jesus was able to respond as he did in this moment because he felt their pain. He felt their need. He felt their longing in the very core of his being. You could say his stomach is tied up in knots when he sees them. I wonder if you've ever experienced a feeling like that, because it's hard to ignore. Jesus finds himself experiencing a gut reaction to the scene in front of him, and he doesn't hesitate. He sets the rest of his retreat agenda aside, and he feeds the hungry crowd both physically and spiritually. And in doing so, he prioritizes loving these people over loving his plans. You know, at this point in the story, I realize that I have backed myself into a corner of contradictions. Because I started by admiring Jesus for taking the rest days that he needed. But now I find myself confronted with a Jesus who laid it all aside to be with the people who interrupted his days off. And then I'm left saying, which is it, Jesus? Are we supposed to prioritize self-care? Or are we supposed to prioritize the needs of the people? And perhaps, as is often the case when I find myself asking Jesus these either or questions, the answer is simply yes. So one of the educational requirements that I had to meet for ordination in the United Methodist Church where I'm ordained, it was a unit of clinical pastoral education. It's a CPE is what we call it. And CPE is it's a formal chaplaincy internship, often done through the hospital. And if you talk with clergy of a variety of traditions about CPE, a lot of them will grumble and gripe about it. And near as I can tell, all of the complaining is just because it's really tough. CPE is an intense time of learning not only about pastoral care, but also about yourself. And it's through this pattern of acting and reflecting that includes critically examining oneself so that you can be a better caregiver for others. And it can also be a really tough workload. So some people who do this are able to carve out the time to complete their unit of CPE in a full-time residency. But many of us, like me, well, we had to add on essentially a half-time job of CPE on top of our already full-time jobs that we had. So my unit of CPE required adding on about 25 hours each week for 5 months. And that included group learning, clinical hours, and the dreaded overnight on calls. So part of serving as a chaplain intern meant taking my turn in the rotation for overnight on calls. Those were 16-hour shifts at the hospital where I would be the one paged for any traumas that came in. And my first time on call, I showed up at the hospital with an overnight bag and an assortment of creature comforts to make the otherwise sterile on-call room feel cozy for the night. I grabbed the pager and I prepared to settle in, not really knowing what was ahead. And it turns out that despite the bed that I had made so inviting in that on-call room, sleep wasn't really on the agenda that night. It seemed like every time, just as I laid down to catch some shut-eye, the increasingly annoying pager would go off. And so I would hop out of bed, I would rub my bleary eyes, and I would start the long trek back to the emergency room to do my job. And then I discovered this was the way of overnight on calls. So over the course of these 5 months, I learned a lot about having compassion for people in need. Because you see, as chaplain, every person I encountered in the hospital was experiencing some sort of crisis or trauma. And my job was to be fully present to them in these painful moments of life. And I discovered that in order to do that well, I needed to take care of myself. I quickly learned the tricks of those on-call nights. So for me, that actually still meant bringing comforts of home, but it also meant a good, healthy dinner, and most importantly, being well rested. I learned not to bring a lot of other work with me that would tempt me to spend my limited but necessary hours of rest that I had there on things that were actually not the priority of the moment. I learned that if I went into those shifts already exhausted, then I would find myself a little too cranky every time that pager woke me up. And even worse, I would find myself phoning it in with those for whom I was caring. If I was tired, I might be saying most of the right things, but I wasn't fully present to the people. So I needed to arrive at the hospital already well rested from the days prior so that I could dig deeply into my well of compassionate reserves to really love these people as I was called to love them. And when I did that, I discovered the beauty of this time in CPE, of this time being a chaplain. And I discovered holy and sacred moments with these strangers turned friends who would invite me to journey with them on their most challenging of nights. So I go back to that story that I was reading in the Bible and this compassion that Jesus felt for the crowds on the shore. You know, it wasn't just a simple expression of goodwill or perhaps worse, pity for them. He wasn't phoning it in, saying all of the right things while mentally calculating how long it would be until he could escape to the retreat that he really wanted to be on. This was gut-wrenching compassion. It was a visceral response, something that required him to dig deep into his own reserves so that he could fully love them in that moment. And when I read that story, I'm not sure it would have happened without the boat ride. Because we don't know how long Jesus and his disciples were on the boat before they came ashore. The gospel writer of Mark's gospel doesn't give a lot of detail, but what I do know is it was long enough. It was long enough for them to get away and find some peace and quiet. Perhaps it was long enough for them to get some uninterrupted sleep. Perhaps it was long enough to give them an extended period without thinking about work so that they could unclutter their minds for a bit. Perhaps it was long enough for them to disconnect from all of the incessant notifications, whatever would be the first century equivalent of on-call pagers or today the ding of smartphone notifications. I don't know what route they took on that boat or how long they were on the water, but what I do know is it was long enough. And so today, we may not each be faced with crowds on the lakeshore who are clamoring for our attention. Most of us are probably not going to be facing families who are experiencing unimaginable trauma in the ER. But this call of compassion is still for all of us. We are called to love people, even and especially when they disrupt our carefully ordered plans. We're called to look upon the interrupters of our days with compassionate eyes. We're called to cultivate this gut-wrenching love and compassion for all people, even the ones who annoy and irritate us. We are called to love people, period. But in order to do that well, we have to rest. Jesus said to those disciples, "Come and rest for a while." So what does a while look like? For me, I know what it doesn't look like, and that's the 2 straight weeks without a day that's really and truly off. And I hope soon to discover what a while is for me this day. You know, I once worked with a very wise clergy person who was talking with me about time away. And she said, you know, very few things in life and ministry are actually emergencies. Very few things in life and ministry are actually emergencies. And her words stuck with me because she's right. Now, don't get me wrong, death and illness don't typically come on schedule. Emergencies do happen. And when they do, we can and should set everything aside to be with the ones in need. But when I look at my calendar of those past 2 weeks of busyness, most of it wasn't an emergency. They may have felt urgent in the moment, but those meetings and appointments that I scheduled in every open time, they could have waited. And if I had recognized that, I probably wouldn't be so tired and cranky today. You might be familiar with some of the poetry of the Reverend Dr. Lynn Unger. She has written a number of really beautiful poems, and there's one that she wrote called Camas Lilies. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I would encourage you at some point to explore that poem as well as some of her other poems that she's written. But in this poem, she has a really striking suggestion, and I do want to share that with you. She writes this. She says, "And you, what of your rushed and useful life? Imagine setting it all down. Papers, plans, appointments, everything. Leaving only a note. Gone to the fields to be lovely. Be back when I'm through with blooming." Perhaps if we find ourselves more cranky than compassionate these days, and let's be real, I don't know you all, but a lot of us are cranky, right? So perhaps if that's where we find ourselves, we need to spend a while in the fields with the lilies until we are just as lovely, blooming with love. The divine is calling to us today. Come away with me. Set aside everything and rest for a while. Turn off your phone, put up the away message, and take as much time as you need. And then you just might trade in that crankiness you've got going on right now for something that's a whole lot more life-giving. Friends, we all need to rest. And we need to rest so that we can then be people of this compassion that will turn us inside out if we let it. Because loving people isn't always easy, and it certainly isn't convenient, but it is what we are all called to do. And we need to replenish ourselves with rest and solitude along the way. It is possible to do both, to love fiercely and abundantly, and still take some naps along the way. So let us go and do likewise. Amen.
Thank you, Mary, for bringing your cranky self today and giving us some great ideas to think about self-care versus compassion for people. Each week we take an offering that supports the work of this congregation in our lives, in our communities, and in the world. Today and in the weeks to come, you may make your offering in one of three ways, which are listed for you on the screen. Using text to give at the number noticed there, 815-332-0643. Giving online through the Tree of Life UU Breeze address, or mailing a check to 5603 Bull Valley Road, McHenry, Illinois, 60050. You could indicate which fund, the pledge or second Sunday or general fund, on the memo line. That would be very helpful. And remember that during this time of uncertainty, your generosity, the Tree of Life, is more important than ever. And as always, we give thanks for these gifts and for all the gifts you bring. Sharing our joys and concerns is a sacred moment in our worship when we open our hearts to receive and embrace each other's lives. If there is something new in your personal life, an event or situation of joy or challenge that touches you, please feel invited to share this to help our community grow in connection. All announcements will appear in our newsletter unless there is a request for them to be withheld. If you do have something to share, please click on either the Reactions tab at the bottom or possibly on the Participants tab at the bottom of the screen, and then click the Raise Your Hand tab. I will then call on you, and you may unmute yourself. I do have one here today from Heather Madaus through Judy. And Heather says, I have permission from Wendell Broussard to include this in Joys and Concerns on Sunday. Wendell's father, Phil Crow, suffered a heart attack and is fighting a very serious infection that's preventing the surgery he needs. He is currently hospitalized and will remain so until his surgical needs can be addressed. Healing energy and love are welcome, as well as cards to the Broussard home here and Wendell's parents' home in Florida. And I think Judy has put that in the chat tab. It's a Seminole, Florida address, and we look at this and give a lot of compassion to Wendell and Ryan and their family as her father is fighting off this infection, and hope that everything gets better as quickly as possible. I know Wendell's here today, I don't see her hand up, so we'll leave it at that for the moment. Do we have any other announcements today? Joys and concerns? See none. We will now honor all those unexpressed joys and concerns that remain on our hearts for the space of 3 cleansing breaths.
I invite you into a posture of prayer. Holy One, Spirit of life and love, you are always ever more ready to hear than we are to speak. And so we come to you in this moment with the sense that you are waiting for us. And yet we confess we don't quite know what to say. We carry with us our worries, our concerns, and also our hopes and our joys. Some of those that we've been able to give voice to, but others that weigh silently on our hearts. You are ready to hear, but we're not quite sure what to say. And so in this moment, we rest in the assurance that you know us better than we know ourselves, that you can make sense of our wordless whispers and the longings deep inside of us that we are still making sense of, that you are with us in this space, inviting us to rest a while, to pause from the frenetic pace of life and simply be with you. So here we are, Holy One of endless compassion, lingering in this space and resting in your love. This love that we rest in is an active love. It is engaged, it is involved, it is immersed. This love is seen in what you do, not just in what you say. In the blessing of children, in the meals with outcasts, in the touching of the untouchable, in your presence, and your self-giving, in your opening of the way to life to all who will come. And your love, Holy One, is expressed especially through people like us. As we share our wealth and our resources in simplicity and generosity. As we share wholeness in care and healing of the sick and the broken. As we share hospitality by being truly present to the lonely, the imprisoned, and the marginalized. As we share peace in kindness, listening and acceptance with those who challenge us, confront us, and threaten us. As you have loved us in incarnate action, may we learn to be little incarnations of your love. Those through whom your love is expressed and experienced in all we say and do. Amen.
Thank you, Mary. Now let's sing together as Billy Seger plays another Peter Mayer song, one of our favorites, Blue Boat Home.
Low below me, I feel no motion, standing on these mountains and plains, far away from the rolling ocean. Still my dry land heart can say, I've been sailing all my life now. Never harbor or port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my blue boat home. Sun, my sail, and moon, my rudder, as I ply the starry sea, leaning over the edge in wonder, casting questions into the deep, drifting here with my ship's companions, all we kindred pilgrim souls, making our way by the lights of the heavens in our beautiful blue boat home. I give thanks to the waves upholding me, hail the great winds urging me on, read the infinite sea before me, sing the sky my sailor's song. I was born upon the fathoms, never harbor or port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my blue boat home.
Thank you, Billy. Please join me in reading our closing words. Be ours a religion which, like sunshine, goes everywhere. Its temple all space, its shrine the good heart, its creed all truth, its ritual works of love, its profession of faith, divine living. We will now extinguish our chalice. If you have a chalice or flame at home, you can do the same as I start with these words. We extinguish this flame of communal worship and now carry its light within us. We share this light. We carry its warmth to all whom we meet.
Friends, may you go from this place to rest for a while, however long that must be, so that when you come back lovelier than before, you can be filled with gut-wrenching compassion for all of the people you meet, even and especially when they interrupt and disrupt all of your plans. Go in the life-giving love of the divine. Go in peace.